Okay. Health and politics, the case of the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. First, thank you for affording me this opportunity to speak to you. Let me first introduce you to my study population. It is the part of the indigenous Palestinian population who in 1948 became citizens of the State of Israel shortly after it was established. Around that time, some 85% of Palestinian residents of what was to become Israel were forced to cross the borders and become refugees in neighboring countries, while we, the remaining 15%, were crossed by a border, so to speak, to become Israeli citizens through no choice of ours. We now make up over 20% of the total population of Israel, a sizable minority. In the Nakba of 1948, the catastrophe, we call it, nearly a third of this group, of the group that stayed as citizens of Israel, were internally displaced to become internal refugees, and Israel calls them as present absentees, thus losing their right to their homes and private property, including their land and any bank accounts. The remaining two-thirds lost most of their land to confiscation by a state that defined us for all practical purposes out of its civic domain and the emerging concept of public good. The great majority of Israeli citizens reside in communities segregated by race, Arabs versus Jews. For the first 2 decades after the Nakba, Palestinian communities were placed under a draconian military rule that controlled our every movement, controlled our access to work and to education and to health facilities. When that ended in 1966, we were left in the grip of the secret apparatus, the Shin Bet, which continues till the present to manipulate our lives, especially the fate of our youth. Now let's look at some of the health determinants as they apply to our community. If you look at table number 1, it's entitled Selected Indicators of Inequality. The figures relate especially to 2 of the 3 classic independent determinants of infant mortality rate, the health indicator at the heart of this paper. The figures there in table number 1 relate to income and education, essentially. The third component, which is the environment that affects the level of infant mortality rates, the classical 3 components. That one I will not relate to here, but if time permits, maybe we can get back to it. I want here to call your attention to one subtle set of figures that inadvertently reveals the discriminatory role played directly by the state in the welfare and hence in the health of the 2 communities under consideration, Arabs in Israel and Jews in Israel. These are the figures about the percentage of families in each group that were poor before and then after the state's intervention in the form of tax and support and welfare payments. Notice then The percent of poor families that were aided by government intervention to escape poverty and rise above the statistically defined poverty line. You will see that only 8% of the Arab families and 49% of the Jewish families, originally poor, were rescued out of poverty by the state's intervention. And that's for the year 2012. And it's similar in other years as well. So let's now shift to the main subject of my talk, the infant mortality rate. The group I am addressing, of course, is not in need of introduction to infant mortality rate as the best single measure of a community's health and total well-being. So table number 2 lists the infant mortality rate for the various religious groups in Israel over time. Muslims are 84% of the total Arab population of Israel, the total citizens of Israel who are of Palestinian Arab origin. In graph number 1, I show the standard presentation of the infant mortality rate figures for Jews and for Muslims, who are the majority of the Arabs in Israel. When Israeli officials present this kind of graph in international fora, they proudly take credit for the fact that the infant mortality rate figures for our Palestinians, as Israelis are likely to say, are better than those of any Arab country, and especially better than the infant mortality rate of other Palestinian groups. This gloss on the data is misguided given my right to equal resources and equal treatment under the law. We are Israeli citizens since day one. We pay taxes in Israel and not in Egypt or Jordan. For me to accept any standard of comparison other than the highest attainable standard by any group in my country of citizenship is to betray the basic principles of both the public health profession and human rights that I aspire to. Israeli officials also point to the significant and continuing decline in both groups, that's Jewish and Arab, infant mortality rates, and the narrowing of the gap in absolute terms between the figures for the two groups over time. On the face of it, this is an impressive feat indeed. However, seen through the lens of equality and justice, which I argue is essential for me, these same data suggest something different altogether. The last column in table number 2, that of the relative ratio of the infant mortality rate, infant mortality rate for Muslims to the infant mortality rate for Jews, that relative ratio is also shown in graph number 2. Notice that it hovers around the figure 2 for the first half century of Israel's existence. Needless to say, in an idealistic situation, the number should be 1, of course. Now, let's look at some of the questions that I would like to raise because of these statistics. From the critical perspective of equality, the first question to be asked is, why should there be a gap between the two population groups in the first place in terms of infant mortality rates? Remember, nearly half of the constituent Jewish population of Israel arrived from the countries of the Middle East and North Africa with sociocultural attributes and health situations not unlike those of the Palestinians, if not worse. The difference is that the state, backed by the world Jewish community, of course, invested massive funds and efforts in well-coordinated programs for the socioeconomic betterment of this group. As for the Palestinian minority in Israel, not only that there were no parallel programs for them, but also that their agrarian communal infrastructure was systematically destroyed with massive land confiscations and limitations on crop selection and marketing and on irrigation schemes for the benefit of Jewish cooperative farms, the famous kibbutzim and moshavim. As the Oriental Jews, the Sephardim in Israel, were corralled into Ashkenazi cultural hegemony, members of the Palestinian Arab community in Israel were further marginalized to become day laborers in construction and agriculture in Jewish cities and new settlements. Palestinian communities lost their agriculture base while being locked out of development such as industry and commerce. Their image as a peripheral enemy locale added to their isolation. They became bedroom communities to which men returned nights and weekends. This was the actualization of Zionist dreams of using the Palestinians as hewers of wood and carriers of water, as the Prime Minister's advisor on Arab affairs once recommended. The effect of the marginalization process on health and hence on the infant mortality rate was predictable, actually. The difference between Arab and Jewish infant mortality rates became part of Israel's accepted reality and part of the system's standard of reference. Hence, when the Ministry of Health experts in the 1980s devised a special project to track down and deal with specific preventable excess infant deaths, the cutoff point for selecting participating Arab towns and villages was set at twice that for Jewish ones. An infant mortality rate of 20 for the Arabs versus 10 for the Jews. In considering the infant mortality rate of the two groups from a perspective of equality, the second prominent feature to notice, other than the existence of this 2-to-1 relative ratio most of the time, is its significant rise since the turn of the present century, to where it now stands at 2.6. My own explanation for this, and I hope that you will consider that, for this unexpected graphic turn of events is that it comes on the heels of a major and continuing rightward shift in Israel's political views to the disadvantage of the Palestinian minority. The essence of this ultra-rightist shift is a change of conception among the majority of Jewish Israelis from that of the classic Zionist colonialist framework to the open fascism of the current political leadership. With that, I will end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions for you. Thank you so much for listening to me.